Ukraine has effectively refused to observe the ceasefire on May 9 since the Russian Federation broke the ceasefire on May 6. Ukraine sees no reason to observe the ceasefire proposed by Russia in connection with the celebration of Victory Day in Moscow on May 9. The reason is obvious. Russia violated the ceasefire declared by Ukraine within the very first hours, starting from midnight on May 6. On the night of May 6, Russia attacked Ukraine with 108 strike drones and missiles of various types. In addition, according to President Zelensky, since midnight on May 6, the armed forces of the Russian Federation have committed 1,820 ceasefire violations, stormed Ukrainian positions, attacked Ukrainian cities and villages with drones, and carried out airstrikes. Therefore, sources in the office of the President of Ukraine have already stated that they see no reason to observe the ceasefire declared by Vladimir Putin and are preparing massive attacks on Russia. Exactly on the day of the victory parade in Moscow. Russia is already threatening Ukraine with retaliatory measures in case of any provocation during the May 9 parade. But these very threats indicate that the Kremlin's master, Vladimir Putin, is unable to reliably protect either the rear areas or the capital. After all, if he were capable, why make threats? In reality, he's trying to intimidate Kyiv, saying, "Please don't strike us because then we will definitely retaliate." My name is Alexei Pechi. Let's discuss this topic together, but before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, give it a like, and leave any comment under this video. If you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so with any donation using the links and details in the description of this video, or by using the QR code, or by becoming a sponsor on the YouTube platform. In general, if you find this episode interesting and useful, at the end of the episode I'll ask you to support the work of our YouTube channel with your donations.
Ukraine will respond in kind. Depending on the situation tonight and tomorrow, we will also decide on our entirely justified responses. If that one person in Moscow who can't live without war is only interested in one parade and nothing else, then that's another matter. Russia has fought itself into a situation where their main parade now depends on us.
So, as sources from the Ukrainian authorities told Kyiv Independent today, Ukraine sees no reason to observe the ceasefire proposed by Russia in connection with the celebration of Victory Day on May 9. This statement came after the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, said that Russia had violated the ceasefire agreement proposed by Ukraine 1,820 times by 10 a.m. local time just a few hours later. Let me remind you that I mentioned earlier that Zelensky made a clever move, because Vladimir Putin stated the day before that on May 8 and 9 they would unilaterally declare a ceasefire and really hope that Kyiv would agree to it. To which Kyiv responded, "Okay, we declare a ceasefire starting May 6, and if you don't observe it, then what's the point for Ukraine to follow the ceasefire you proposed?" Let me remind you, Zelensky stated on May 4 that Ukraine would introduce a ceasefire starting May 6 after Vladimir Putin proposed a separate truce on Victory Day, May 8 and 9. Earlier, let me remind you, Moscow reduced the scale of the planned victory parade, its annual display of military power, amid concerns about possible attacks from Ukraine. Once, or at least as they saw themselves, the mighty Russian army, now they're simply afraid to even go out onto Red Square, which you would think is the most protected place in Russia, but no, they're afraid. They're afraid of strikes from Ukraine. And now the office of the President of Ukraine has stated that Kyiv is genuinely interested in an unconditional ceasefire, not just a temporary one, the only purpose of which is to allow Vladimir Putin to hold a military parade, after which Russia will continue to carry out indiscriminate attacks on the civilian population. Therefore, it is obvious that the only goal of Vladimir Putin, who proposed a ceasefire on May 8 and 9, is to avoid the humiliating disruption of the military parade on May 9 in Moscow. And we must remember that the main nightmare of the bold dictator Vladimir Putin is if the military parade is disrupted or ruined, which sends a signal to the Russian population that this bold little man, Vladimir Putin, is weak. He is really losing this war and is unable to guarantee the safety of Russians, nowhere at all. Well, if Flamingo missiles are already hitting a factory 1,000 kilometers from the Ukrainian border, it shows that Vladimir Putin can't guarantee anything to Russians. He can only oppress them, make them even bigger slaves than they are now, block their internet, mobile communications, and so on. As a result, after the night shelling of Ukraine by Russian occupiers, Volodymyr Zelensky stated, quote, Ukraine has clearly stated that it will act in kind, considering the persistent Russian appeals through the media and social networks asking for a ceasefire during the Moscow parade. A full-scale war is a bad time for public celebrations. Ukraine will determine its next steps after the evening reports from Ukrainian intelligence and the military. At the same time, Zelensky noted that the concentration of Russian air defense around Moscow weakens other regions of Russia and opens up new opportunities for Ukrainian long-range strikes. At the same time, Russia is already threatening Ukraine with retaliatory measures in case of any provocation during the May 9 parade. But these threats themselves indicate only one thing: that balding Vladimir Putin is unable to reliably protect either the rear areas or even the capital of the Russian Federation. Analysts at the Institute for the Study of War believe that the head of the Kremlin is stubbornly holding on to the parade because he does not want to admit that Ukraine has long since brought the war onto Russian territory itself. This year's May 9th celebrati on Red Square in Moscow will be the most modest in all the years since the war began in 2014. In other words, this will be the most modest celebration since the Russian occupiers seized Crimea. No military equipment, only a marching column of shameful occupiers. The number of guests has been reduced to a minimum. Instead of the usual thousands of people, there will be practically no foreign guests, such as leaders, prime ministers, and so on. The event itself will last less than an hour, and even that hour includes the broadcast. That is, showing a video of how the Russian occupiers are fighting in Holy Ukraine. Even Russian ultranationalist bloggers who make up part of Vladimir Putin's electoral core are increasingly criticizing the balding dictator for his unwillingness to acknowledge the new reality. Ukraine is striking deep into Russia, and this is no longer news, it's already the norm. This is the norm, the everyday reality that Russians are living with now. Ukraine is striking deep into Russia. Although, it's worth noting that I personally do not expect Ukrainian strikes on Moscow during the victory parade on May 9th. On one hand, this could really provoke the balding dwarf Vladimir Putin to attack Kyiv. Why would we want that? On the other hand, it's a choice between showy spectacle and actual effectiveness. Especially considering there are targets in other parts of Russia that are now unprotected by air defense, since Putin has pulled it all to Moscow. Well, for example, it would be much more effective to blow up a couple more oil refineries or military factories than to waste resources attacking the frightened Vladimir Putin on Red Square. Yes, the image would be dramatic. Yes, of course, it would show Putin's weakness, but how effective it is in the context of the war is questionable. That's why I personally don't expect such an attack. And Putin's very proposal to declare a ceasefire is a tactic aimed at making it seem to President Donald Trump that he supposedly wants peace. This is a sham ceasefire, and for Trump, unfortunately, that's quite enough. It's telling that the Russian occupation authorities in Crimea have cancelled the Victory Day celebrations altogether this year for security reasons. Let me emphasize again, they cancelled the Victory Day celebrations. I remember Putin used to say that he had already won the war against Ukraine, or that he was winning. Now he suddenly cancels Victory Day. And for security reasons. How can a victorious country or the winning side be afraid to hold the victory parade? What happened? What kind of security reasons are there? Is something really flying over Russia? And now, the head of the occupation authorities of Crimea, Sergei Aksyonov, has announced that this year there will be no military parade or other large events in Crimea, including even the regular march of those grandfathers with canes from the Immortal Regiment. Even that won't happen. They're afraid. They're afraid. And shortly after President Zelensky's announcement that Russia had disrupted the ceasefire, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine condemned Moscow for violating it. And here is a quote from the Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Moscow has once again ignored a realistic and fair call for a ceasefire supported by other states and international organizations. This shows that Russia rejects peace, and its false calls for a ceasefire on May 9 have nothing to do with diplomacy. Putin cares only about military parades, not about human lives. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. And if you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so with any donation or a paid membership using the links and details in the description of this video or via the QR code. I would appreciate any support from you. Also, subscribe to my Telegram channel Pechi News. The link is in the description of this video. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.